Foul as Fair, Chapter 16, The Hounds. Now that she could stop worrying about falling into the river, Megan's attention shifted toward worrying about the hounds. She was certain that with all the noise Kasha had made, the smell of the cats, the smell of people, or just bad luck, there would be snarling monster hounds investigating at any moment. Despite her nightmare imaginings, the area remained quiet. Unfortunately, with the terrain shifting from the plains and wooded terrain on the other side of the river to rocky hills, she also had little idea of how big the area was, or how close any of the hounds might be. Suspecting the baying monsters from the paintings around any turn or just behind every rise was, to her mind, almost as bad as actually seeing them. Given the slow and careful progress of the group, Aisling's general quiet, and even Kasha and the cats going tense, Megan guessed she wasn't alone in her paranoia. She continued to trust in Aisling's sense of direction, the crow flying out over the hills and scouting ahead, then wheeling back to be certain the others were still following. Despite the extra effort in scaling the occasional difficult hills, particularly for the chariot, the small group kept making the effort, pausing at the top of each rise to look around at the territory below. Megan always felt safest on the hilltops, but, of course, they couldn't stay there for long. With the group in the midst of one of the climbs down the back side of one large hill, Aisling and the Count came diving back to the group. They're coming, run now!" the pixie shouted all the way. At least she did right up until the point when a nightmare beast came racing over the top of the hill, leaping without hesitation, trying to snap at the bird in midair. Either Aisling or the crow noticed in time and managed to climb, but the Count still lost a couple of tail feathers. Megan stopped mid-climb, just staring at the monster dog. She was pretty sure she'd seen a few horses that weren't quite that big, and it sounded like it was just the first of many. Sounds of baying started echoing through the hills. "Megan, come on!" Lanny shouted, tugging at Megan's jacket. The pair began to run, almost stumbling a few times. Kasha finally reached back, pulling each of them onto the chariot, though they had to split their effort between clutching the side of the chariot and clinging to Kasha to stay in place, as the satyr urged the leopards into a full run. The vehicle bounced and rattled down the hill. More than once, Megan was pretty sure it was going to flip over, at least as many times as she felt like it was going to be thrown free despite her death grip, and almost as many as the times she thought she was about to be sick. They reached the bottom in one piece, and Kasha turned sharply, trying to stay in the valleys between the hills so she wouldn't lose speed. Megan, glancing back, started catching sight of more and more massive forms emerging from all over the area, scaling the hills to get a view of the area, and forming up into packs before tearing after them. Caught up in watching the horde forming behind them, Megan's head whirled around when she heard one of the cats howl a warning, followed by cursing from Kasha in what Megan was pretty sure was at least 3 languages. She'd heard of packs of dogs or wolves working together to drive prey into traps, which was what she was guessing had just happened, as more of the monster beasts were swarming out over the nearby hilltops. Kasha pulled on a rein, and the cats turned sharply, taking the chariot up an incline and over rocky outcroppings large enough to briefly send the vehicle into the air, landing awkwardly on one wheel. Kasha leaned hard in the other direction, and despite spending a few moments tipped precariously, the chariot came down on both wheels, just in time for Kasha to need to turn sharply again. She barely avoided the closest hound as it leapt from the top of the hill they'd been climbing, landing where they'd have been had Kasha's reflexes been any less. "This way, this way, this way!" Aisling called frantically from nearby. Without hesitation, Kasha turned the chariot and charged in the direction of the pixie's voice. Despite the risk of low altitude, the Count dropped to just ahead of the leopards, leading the way at high speed. More of the hounds were closing in on either side of them, but they stayed just ahead of the packs, though a few snapping jaws got close enough that Megan could feel the hot breath. "Aisling, higher!" Megan heard herself calling, more than a little surprised that her first thoughts were of getting at least the pixie out of reach. She was even more surprised when the flighty little creature looked back, shook her head firmly, and continued to lead the way, rising only to make sure that they were still on a clear path, making adjustments for Kasha to follow. The chariot made another jump, landing amid stones and dirt loose enough to send it skidding off to one side, briefly pulling one of the leopards off balance. The shift in momentum was enough to break Lonnie's grip, and she went tumbling over the side of the chariot, landing hard and head first. The cats recovered enough to take off at a run again, either not noticing or not caring that they'd left a passenger behind. "Lonnie!" Megan called, leaping off the back of the chariot, reaching her friend before the nearest houndstead. With Lonnie trying to struggle to her feet, obviously dizzy, Megan tackled her out of the way of the nearest hound. With more hounds coming from seemingly all directions, Megan did the first thing that came to mind, singing a few bars of the first song she thought of at the top of her lungs. To her surprise, a sudden gust of intense wind picked up some of the loose dirt and debris, carrying it into the eyes of the foremost hounds. The lead dogs pulled up short, trying to shake the irritants out of their eyes, and the hounds behind them crashed into the lead rank. Megan tried again, hitting the next bars as another hound came at them. This time, nothing happened. She tensed, seeing the creature bearing down on her, before it pulled up short, snapping at a black, feathered form that just clawed at the side of its head. "Megan, go!" Aisling shouted, dive-bombing a few more of the hounds, weaving and climbing and turning the small pack around. Once Megan helped Lonnie to her feet, the two started to run again, though unlike last time, they went at full sprint. Now it was Lonnie who was lagging behind, visibly almost losing her balance a few times. Megan slowed. Lonnie opened her mouth as if to argue, but Megan interrupted, "Not leaving you." Coming around another hill, Megan saw a flat expanse, extending quite some way away before reaching another rise, this one an almost vertical wall of rocks and occasional grass patches. From here it looked like a trap, somewhere the hounds would pin them against with nowhere to run, provided they didn't just run them down in the open plain, which seemed far more likely. Then her eyes settled on Kasha and the cats, turned and waiting for them. Megan tugged on Lonnie's arm, starting towards the satyr even as the baying picked up again. A glance back confirmed that the distraction was over, and the hounds were in pursuit again. She turned her head back around, starting to sprint for Kasha, who appeared to be talking to someone, and the cats, though looking agitated, were howling and hissing back. Kasha finally seemed to reach a consensus, shaking her head at the girls running her way. Just as Megan was thinking she was about to abandon them, Kasha instead pointed towards the vertical rise in the distance. Megan gave another panicked glance back, then looked at Kasha again. The satyr gestured again, more insistent, and Megan altered her course, just sprinting for the wall. A howl unlike anything Megan had ever heard drew her gaze again. She'd seen the expression, or something like it, on Kasha's face before, when the leprechaun had splashed her. Now it was even more intense, the woman's face flushing darker as she shouted. Both cats joined in the howl, and the chariot took off again, but this time towards the pack of hounds. The war cry and the battle howl began to turn into a grin, but it was somehow no less savage as the chariot rocketed forward with Kasha calling, "You won, you won, you won, wow, wow!" as they charged. The unexpected tactic took the hounds off guard, and at first they parted before her berserk rush. Once Kasha had their attention, more of the hounds turning her way, the chariot spun around and raced off, with the surprised dogs gathering up and taking off in pursuit again. It was only when she heard Aisling's shouts again that Megan turned back around, moving faster once she stopped watching the high-speed chase. Lonnie was picking up speed, along with better balance, with recovery time, and Aisling kept looping back around to make sure both girls were focused ahead and ignoring the shouts and howls and baying behind them. It seemed to take forever, and both girls were thoroughly out of breath as they finally reached the wall. Megan craned her neck upward, looking at the sheer wall ahead of them. "That's a long way up,"